Good evening and welcome to End Time Ministries. Tonight's subject is going to be called God's Continued Guidance. And it's God's continued guidance in spite of unbelief. It's based on Psalms 78. And we'll start off with verse 1 and we'll go through. It's quite a lengthy chapter, but we'll stop along the way and make commentary and allow for you to give it some thought before proceeding forward. I hope everyone is doing well this evening and hoping that all is well with you and your family. And we'll jump right into the scripture here. God's continued guidance in spite of the unbelief. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and the strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, uh, which he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come may know them, even the children which shall be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. This is a generational thing, and it's going from God to the patriarchs of the family, and it's going from there to one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, and so on and so on. And he says, it's for the establishment of testimony in Jacob, the appointed law in Israel. He commanded our fathers he should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might make them known even to the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. To be steadfast with God means you got to be continuous with God. You can't be wishy-washy with God. You got to set your face like flint, and you've got to push forward, regardless of what the circumstances are, whether you're in season or out of season, whether it's under duress or whether it's in good times or bad times, you still stick with God. And verse 8 says, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set their not heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. The children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They kept not the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, and forgot his works and his wonders that he had showed them. Marvelous things did he in the sights of their fathers, in the land of Egypt and in the land of Zoan. He divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters to stand as a heap. And this is a description of the miracles that God did in the sight of that generation. And pay close attention to all of these miracles that he performed, and yet they still were not steadfast in standing with God whenever he requested for them to do so in his commandments. So he divided the sea and caused them to pass through, and he made the waters to stand as a heap. In the daytime also he led them with a cloud, and all the night with the light of a fire. He clave the rocks, meaning he broke the rocks in the wilderness, and gave them drink as out of the great depths, like a never-ending flow of water. He brought streams also out of the rock, and caused the waters to run down like rivers. And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness. And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust, instead of the manna from heaven that God had been providing for them all those years and they lacked nothing. All they had to do was just collect the manna that was given to them every day, and it was sufficient for their nutrition. But yet they tempted God by asking for meat. In other words, they showed um, they didn't show gratitude for what God had done for them. They showed contempt for what He had done. Yet they spake against God and said, "Can God furnish a table in the wilderness?" In other words, they were saying then, was God even able to do more than what He was doing, in spite of the fact that it was miraculous what He was doing? And behold, He smote the rock, and the waters gushed, and the streams overflowed. They said, "Can He give bread also? Can He provide flesh for His people?" So He was getting a lot of questions, being thrown at Him from the generation that did not trust in God and did not trust in His word and trust in His leadership. And afterwards they said, "Therefore the Lord heard this, and He was wroth." In other words, He was upset. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel. Well, God was angry because He was provoked. They provoked Him to anger by saying that he strong enough to do greater things than what He was already doing, and they were not thankful for what He had done. So therefore, because they believed not in God and trusted not in His salvation, though He had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven and rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them the corn of heaven, man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow into heaven, and by His power He brought in the south wind. He rained flesh upon them as dust, and feathered fowl like as the sand of the sea. And He let it fall in the midst of their camps round about their habitations. So they did eat and were well filled, and He gave them over to their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while the meat was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them, and smote the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still, and believed not His wondrous works. Therefore their days did He consume in vanity, and their years in trouble. And when He slew them, then they sought Him. After He started exacting His punishment upon them, they turned toward Him. And they returned and inquired early after God. In other words, they knew who was the boss, and they knew who was in charge, and they knew who had delivered them from the Egyptians. And all of a sudden their lust had left them, and they were coming back to God. And they remembered that God was their rock and the high God, their Redeemer. Nevertheless did they flatter Him with their mouth, and they lied unto Him with their tongues. For their heart was not right with Him, neither were they steadfast in His covenant. But He, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned He His anger away, and did not stir up all of His wrath. God is a long-suffering God. He is not willing to see the wicked destroyed, and He will give them every chance and every opportunity to live and to choose righteousness over evil. And He did not seek their destruction at this particular time, even though He was fully aware of what they were doing, and that they were not legitimate in their beliefs, and that they were lying with their tongues. He was still full of compassion for them. And He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again. How oft did they provoke Him in the wilderness, and grieve Him in the desert? Yea, they turned back and trusted God and limited the Holy One. Yea, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy. In other words, out of all of the traps and snares and tribulations and trials that they had been through, and God had delivered them out of every single one, they had just forgotten it. Their minds were blank and blinded to it, and they had forgotten it. It says, yet they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. In other words, they limited him based on their beliefs. And yea, they remember not his hand, nor the day he delivered them from the enemy, and how he wrought his signs in Egypt and the wonders in the field of Zoan, and how he had turned their rivers into blood and their floods that they could not drink. And he sent divers sorts of flies among them that devoured them, and frogs which destroyed them. And he gave also their increase unto the caterpillar, and their labor unto the locust. He destroyed their vines with the hail, and the sycamore trees with frost. He gave up the cattle also to the hail, and the flocks to the hot thunderbolts. Lightning struck the cattle. He cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation and trouble, by sending evil angels among them. He made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to pestilence. He smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacle of Ham, but made his own people to go forth like sheep, and guided them like in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them safely, so that they feared not, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. Talking about the Red Sea crossing. And he brought them to the border of his sanctuary, even to his mountain, talking about Mount Sinai, which is his right hand, which his right hand had purchased. He cast out the heathen also before them, and divided an inheritance by line, and made the tribes of Israel to dwell in their tents. In other words, he divided the tribes into 12 tribes of Israel, and gave each part a portion of Israel. Yet they tempted and provoked the Most High, and kept not his testimonies. And in the midst of all of these miracles and all these deliverances and everything else, their love and their trust and their allegiance to him was so short-lived that they did not have a heart for God. They turned against him, and they went all back to their own ways of doing things. But they turned back and dealt unto unfaithfully like their fathers. They were turned aside like a deceitful bow, like a bow that could not be relied on to hit the mark of what it was being aimed at. So it was useless. For they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their graven images. In other words, they started to worship other gods. When God heard this, he was wroth and greatly abhorred Israel. He greatly hated it, so that he forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. He turned Israel over to their enemies, and he gave his people over also unto the sword, and was wroth with his inheritance, because they were the apple of his eye. They were the ones that were chosen and brought out. And yet he had done all these things for them, and yet they still turned against him. Fire consumed their young men, and their maidens were not given to marriage. The priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation, meaning that they did not cry. And the Lord awakened as one out of sleep, and like a mighty man that shouted by reason of wine. And he smote his enemies in the hinder parts, and put them in a perpetual reproach. In other words, he took his vengeance out on his enemies. Moreover, he refused the tabernacle of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, and he chose the tribe of Judah and the Mount Zion, which he loved. He built his sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which he had established forever. He chose David also his servant. He took him from the sheepfolds and from following the ewes, great with young. He brought him to feed Jacob his people and Israel his inheritance. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Now you've got to start looking at this whole verse here is in the book of Psalms, and the book of Psalms were put to music a long time ago, and they were written, a good deal of them, by David. However, this one was written by Mashul of Asaph. Asaph was a minister of David's, and he wrote some of the Psalms. However, David was a man after God's own heart, and they were given a recap here of what the Israelites had gone through with all the travails and the troubles and the trials that they had seen throughout all of their history, from being delivered from bondage in Egypt and the snares and the dangers of the wilderness to being brought into the promised land and being given victory over the inhabitants of the promised land that was promised to the children of Abraham and the children of God, the Israelites. Now, the region was called Israel. It was divided into 12 portions based on the 12 tribes of Israel. And some of the tribes were more that were closer to God than others. Judah was the one that was chosen to be the one that was the closest. And God had shown and demonstrated his ability to deliver his people over and over and over again, but yet they constantly provoked him and asked for even more and more and more, which eventually wore him down to the point where he just lost his patience and his temper, and saw where these people were not. They were flattering him with their lips, but they did not love him in their hearts. They did not love him in their hearts. And there's a big difference there. Someone can compliment you and at the same time hate you at the same time. The Israelites, at several points, they turned against Moses, and they wanted to kill Moses. They asked him, were there not enough graves in Egypt to bury them all? Why were they led out to the desert to be killed? And even though Pharaoh released them, he realized what a mistake he made, and he went after them, and he was destroyed in the Red Sea when they tried to cross it, after the Israelites had crossed it by a miracle that God had worked to split the waters of the Red Sea and let the Israelites go across on dry land. All the Israelites had seen this, the first generation, and they were to pass these stories on to their next generations and the next generations, and they were never to forget these deliverances and these miracles that God had provided for them, but yet they had. And they kind of like ho-hummed about it, like, well, if he could have given them manna, why couldn't he have given them meat? Why didn't he just give them a steady stream of water? Why didn't he just take them straight to the promised land without leading them for 40 years? It was because of their unbelief. They could have made it to the promised land in 3 days if they wanted to. But God had known their hearts, and he knew that they were not prepared. So therefore, they stayed in their wilderness state for as long as it took for their hearts to get prepared. And that generation died out. It was a new generation with Joshua that went over into the promised land. It's not the generation that Moses led, but it was the generation of Joshua. And Joshua took over from Moses. And God anointed Joshua and gave him the wisdom and the guidance and the leadership and the intelligence to be able to do what had to be done to bring it about. And as they settled into the promised land, of course, there were skirmishes with other people that were already there. The 12 spies that were sent out, 10 of them came back saying, don't go because it's a trap. There's giants there and that and the other. And 2 of them said, no, we can take it. We can take it. But they listened to the majority of them, so they stayed outside the boundary of Israel and would not listen to God's promise. But all along the way, they weren't just disbelieving God. They were believing Him, but they were provoking Him into doing even bigger and greater things, which was even worse because they were trying to control God. They were trying to control God by their complaints. And God got angry with them because of their lack of gratitude and their lack of thanksgiving, and they weren't grateful. And so He decided He was going to put an end to them. So He turned them over to their enemies. But He did finally put an end to the enemies and finally freed the Israelites up. But can you imagine going through all of this unbelief and God still staying steadfast with these people and not abandon them? He did not abandon them. Not like they abandoned Him. They left Him many, many times, but He never left them once. Oh, He was wroth. His anger was kindled, but He remembered that they were nothing but just soft tissue, and their frames are soft, and that they were easily killed, and that their lives were like a vapor. And He saw things from an eternal perspective. But His will was still done. He still accomplished what He was trying to do. Are we like that today? When people give us something, well, we praise them, we're happy, like at Christmas time and all that, and we go our way, and a week or so later we see the person. Christmas is gone, the lights are gone, the trees are gone, music is gone, and all of a sudden we're back in our same old ways again. We don't remember having fellowship with them. We don't remember having the bountiful blessings of dinner or lunch with them. We don't remember the gifts, how good we felt. All we remember is the grudges we had. All we remember is the evil, the bad things. The good things are kind of like shoved under the rug, and the bad things are kind of like put out on display, to kind of keep the grudges going, so to speak. Well, God does not like that. God is a forgiving God, and God is a long-suffering God. And if He wasn't, mankind wouldn't be here today. He would have wiped Adam and Eve out. He would have wiped Jonah out. He would have wiped Abraham and Lot out. He would have wiped David out. He would have wiped out the nation of Israel. There would be no gospel. There would be no way of salvation, and we would all be going to a fiery, eternal hell of damnation and separation from God. So in order to stop that from happening and going to eternal separation and damnation from God and eternal punishment, God provided a way out. In this New Testament, he sent his son. He came in human form, God did. And he experienced a human experience. And he saw the way humans felt, and he saw the way they operated, and he knew the way they felt. He was one of them. God was one of us. And not only was he one of us, but guess what? He didn't commit any sin. He was not fathered by a man. The Holy Ghost was his father, the third member of the Godhead. And he was sinless, but yet he was made sin for us. He was slandered. He was lied about. He was betrayed. He was scourged by the Roman soldiers in a mock trial. He was spat upon. He had a crown of thorns put on him. They put a scepter on him and a royal robe, and then pushed him around after they had shredded his body and had his skin hanging off his bones. And then they put a heavy cross on him after the crown of thorns and all. They put a heavy cross in his hand, and they made him drag that beam, that heavy beam, wooden beam of the cross, all the way up a steep hill, a rocky hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And they laid him down on it, and they nailed him to it, hands and feet. They put spikes through his hands. They put spikes through his feet. Then they raised him up into a hole and dropped him into the hole. And then they left him there to die, naked to the world, shredded. He didn't hardly look like a human being. He's not like one of those pretty little pictures you see, or one of those nice looking things you see in the Catholic churches where he's a crucifix and he's just got a little bit of blood showing. No, he was bloody all over. You couldn't even recognize him. And not only that, but they also were going to break his legs, but according to the prophecy, they would not, and they did not. But they went ahead and took a spear and stabbed him in the side, near the heart, and blood and water flowed out of it, indicating that he had died from a broken heart. Friends, if God gave you his only son and put him through that, how much more do you think he would look at us today if we did not have the blood of Jesus protecting us and saving us? He gave us a way out of eternal hell and damnation, which was made for Satan and his angels, not for man. And he also put us here to enjoy fellowship with him forever. And this is his way of doing it. Jesus purchased the blood. By his blood, he purchased our souls. And anyone that believes in him, anyone that trusts in him, anyone that comes to him and asks for forgiveness and asks that he come into their heart and save them and live for him and stay steadfast with him to the end, he will save. He will save. You will never see death. You will never see hell and damnation. So make that decision today, because you may not have another choice. Today is the day of salvation. Today I set before you good and evil. Today I set before you life and death. Choose life. All right. God does not have pleasure in the death of the evil, but he does have joy in those that choose life. And all of heaven rejoices when a sinner comes to salvation. Please invite Jesus into your heart today, because it is in your behalf and it is in the behalf of your loved ones and all the ones that you influence around you. Choose God. He's the only way. He is the right way. This is Reverend Dan Beasley, signing off of the End Times Ministry for today. And I ask that you give your heart to Jesus and ask him to come into your heart. And if you want to contact me, I will start broadcasting a number that you can reach me at for prayer or what have you. But please remember, we cannot answer all of your prayer requests, and we cannot answer all of your needs personally, but we will answer them in a general form, if not personally. We will give every attempt to try to answer them personally. So this is Reverend Dan Beasley of Hartsville, South Carolina, signing off for another episode of the End Times Ministries. Thank you and have a good evening.